Well, I'd like to thank you all for not voting against me. It's very important. And before I start talking about my career, I'd like to thank my family and my wife. This is a very successful woman in her own right, and without her support, this would never have happened. We've heard a bit of family quoting here, and there's a quote from my grandfather that really resonated with me and has always affected me. He always said, "Scientists and engineers, always on tap, never on top." Now, following my PhD in microbiology at Trobe University, I was a research scientist at CSIRO Animal Health. I was working with Professor Paul Wood who wasn't professor then, on bovine tuberculosis diagnosis and general animal vaccine projects. And in that exercise, we received the CSIRO medal because we developed a way of diagnosing bovine tuberculosis via a blood test. And that blood test later went on to become what was in the human sense called the quantiferon test. Now, I was happy at CSIRO, but in the end I left because I realised that as a project head with a decent sized team in my 30s, that I was looking at 30 years of exactly the same job. And that was a bit terrifying. So I left and went into industry, and I went to a company called AMRAD, which is a pharma development group, to work on human disease. And AMRAD was much later bought by CSL. I started there in research project evaluation and management, and by the time I finished there 8 years later, I was running the development. And there we developed many compounds, vaccines, biological products, none of which actually worked very well, unfortunately. So that was a bit of a pity. I then left AMRAD because I had a major shift. What had happened is that what was to become the quantiferon technology had been licensed to CSL, but CSL decided that they weren't going to be in diagnostics anymore, and they were getting out of it. So Jim Rothwell, an old CSIRO colleague of mine, came to me and said, well, maybe we can actually do this. And I said, why not? So we took it over and we started a company. Now, I was the CSO and Jim was the CSO, and we raised money and we gathered together a great team of investors, staff and directors, and we went public. And we listed on the ASX. And long story short, we did all the deals and extensive R&D and clinical trials and regulatory approvals that would in the next 10 years make the third generation of quantiferon the standard for TB infection diagnosis around the world. Now, I typed quantiferon into PubMed last night, and there were 1,483 papers using quantiferon. That gives you an estimate of the remarkable penetration this has had. I doubt any other diagnostic has that number of publications. Now, TB is a dangerous infectious disease, so when we did this, we went through very rigorous approvals all around the world, from the FDA and the USA, all through Asia and everywhere. And so we engaged, we marketed, we sold this product in so many countries, it would just be easier to nominate the ones where we didn't sell it, because we were just so hungry to actually make sure that this transformed the way people looked at tuberculosis. So when I actually come here, I feel that my experience is not only in the R&D and regulatory and corporate finance things you might normally expect from a biotech executive, but it's also about production and logistics and sales systems, international relations. And I perceive these as perhaps less common skills in the STEM field and often way undervalued than they should be. Now, in 2011, my company Cellestis was purchased by QIAGEN based in Germany for US $400 million, which very soon left me out of a job. So I'm now a company director at Nucleus Networks, which is Australia's largest early phase clinical trials provider. I'm also director at Ellume Diagnostics in Brisbane. Ellume has a fascinating quantum dot digitised method for point of care and consumer diagnostics. I'm also a director in Sydney at the ASX-listed Genetic Signatures, which has a unique 3-base PCR-based molecular diagnostic method that gives a lot of advantages in terms of sensitivity and workflow in doing molecular diagnostics. Outside that, my interest has been in philanthropy, where my wife Deborah and I have established the Radford Foundation, which has a strong emphasis on youth and making sure that education is taken to youth. And I've also been recently setting up with Paul and Ronnie Wood the IMNIS program and working with ATSE and others to make that a reality. And we've heard IMNIS mentioned before that it's a mentoring program for PhD students. By the way, it's only for PhD students because there's 8,000 STEM PhD students and we didn't have more than 8,000 friends in industry. So we just left it at that. The undergraduates was just a logistic nightmare. Now that leads me on to the challenges that I see us facing in the next 20 years, which of course are many, but I'm going to talk about one which I think is most important. Now, we know that in Australia, a STEM career, as we just heard, is not really regarded as a desirable career option by enough young people. And actually, we're trying to do things on that. We've got education and outreach programs to redress that. Because we all know that the wealth and health of nations in the world is based on STEM. But this outreach is perhaps not enough, in my thinking. I believe that we need active and engaged STEM aspirational role models in the public eye and in the eye of the youth. Because while we know that STEM raises national and world living standards and generates underlying wealth, it's only in some countries, predominantly the United States, where STEM is visibly a major engine of personal fame, wealth and status. And this is important because as young people making serious life choices, they look for the security and status occupations provide. So if successful STEM entrepreneurs are not in the public eye, it's unlikely to be effective as a career choice for young people. And in that public eye, there is overwhelmingly more material in Australia implying that occupations outside of STEM are going to actually give you wealth and status than being a scientist or an engineer. In Australia, as an example, our two Atlassian tech billionaires form but a fraction of the wealthiest people in the country, as compared to the US, where the wealth list is dominated by tech billionaires. Now, I'm not to say that everyone should see massive wealth as their motivation, but people of wealth and corporate influence are in the public eye. They contribute heavily to the zeitgeist, second time it's used today, and this reflects what is seen as desirable by young people. As all parents know, young people desperately wish to conform to the values of their peers. And I want to be clear here also when I'm talking about this idea of making aspirational wealth. I see nothing wrong in making money out of STEM-based enterprises because STEM-based enterprises largely build new money, they build new wealth. They take from no one virtually. So my ambition in working with ATSE and working in IMNIS is to make STEM attractive by showing scientists, not to make STEM attractive by showing scientists happy in mid-level jobs, even though, of course, that's the practical reality for most of us, because that's not an influential motivator to young people. So my goal is to make STEM attractive by helping scientists and engineers to develop the non-STEM skills and the hunger to become social and corporate leaders, to become public figures and role models known for their influence and power, often reflected in their wealth, whose intellectual contribution to society carries weight because without such figures, all the education and outreach in the world will not help, as no young person will really believe that STEM as a career pays off personally. So, of course, most STEM graduates will not be famous, and most of us find our happiness in more moderate outcomes. But without the public figures showing us this, what is indeed possible, why should young people try? Now, to finish up here, because I'm coming in on time here, I'd challenge all of us at ATSE to consider, have we recruited to this organisation those high-profile figures we should have to lead this conversation with young people? And more so, have we made it attractive for them to be part of ATSE, to want to become a fellow? Anyway, I'll just leave you with that question. I didn't have any slides, by the way, not basically because I was too petulant to actually put my slides in 6 weeks in advance, but that's fundamentally it. Thank you very much.